Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. So I recently had an argument with somebody on, some topic relative to do with Scottish independence, but it was more or less a case to do with the whole hang on capitalism and what have you. Even though he's never really read the articles, he just takes things for face value. And these are typically the type of people who turn to these websites like Wikipedia and all the rest of it. And wiki websites are websites that can be manipulated. There was this thing on RationalWiki. Somebody had recommended me to check out before. So let's have a look of what RationalWiki has to say on capitalism. Basically says capitalism is an economic system that is utilised in most countries of the world. Again, this is questionable because capitalism, you're referring to an economic system. What's more accurate to say is we live in a mixed economy between capitalism and socialism, so it's not exactly this capitalist system. It says even in most countries where it is not accepted in theory, it is accepted in practice. Well, this again is questionable because when you're speaking about capitalism, you're speaking about the free market. It says most people agree that it has been more productive than any other economic system the world has tried. Well, yeah, when you're speaking about an economic system, but when you're speaking about capitalism as an economic system, you're speaking about the free market. This isn't a capitalist system. You've strangled the private sector half to death. And he says, and requires comparatively small amounts of centralised oversight. Who says you do? He says to keep it from running out of control. Again, that's just rhetoric. All that is just the usual nonsense typed out by the type of person that hasn't got a clue about recorded history. These are the type of people who probably believe the myth of the robber barons and all the rest of that crap, and probably even believe that, government was their saviour and protector of them and improving wages and all the rest of this. This is why you can't even take these type of people seriously. They don't even know what a capitalist system is. It's basically the separation of the economy from government. It's essentially that led to the rise of the monopolies, oligopolies and cartels. It's what gave rise to corporatism. However, there is the fact that the benefits of this often fall disproportionately to the rich. This is just rhetoric. The reality is with capitalism is the fact that it's done the exact opposite. What he's talking about is basically through all the government intervention, it has basically created this very problem. It's harmed the less fortunate. And it's gave special interest groups favour and competitive advantage over the market. It's usually this myth that you hear that capitalism creates the wider gap between the rich and poor. The usual nonsense. This is exactly what I'm talking about. And he says, with persistent and in some cases dangerous material and social divides in capitalist societies. Well, you're hardly a capitalist society given the fact that you've had the fixing and manipulating of interest rates, the reserve ratios, you're sitting with a central bank, you don't even have free market money, you're sitting there bailing failure out. That's anything but capitalist. And then he says, and there are intellectuals that propose other economic systems are more just or can improve on capitalism. Well, how are they? I mean, every system that's moved away from capitalism, and this is essentially what you're living under today, you're living in a mixed economy that's anti-capitalist, and essentially you're paying the price for it. They turn to these sort of websites and take them through word for word, and they don't even know what they're talking about themselves, whoever it is that wrote it. Don't even get a clue about history, hasn't even got a clue about capitalism, and doesn't even understand it was his socialist government interventionism that created the very problems with corporatism. And he says, for example, some of the least unequal states are those that adopted modified versions of capitalism. Well, hold on a wee second here. What's this obsession today with equality? I couldn't care less about equality. See, the only thing I care about is that the rich get richer and poor get, richer. That's it. That's all that matters. It's actually these very states that, have this such obsession over equality that end up harming the economy. These people preach all this equality nonsense with socialism. You ever looked at a socialist economy and the most socialist countries in the world? Exactly, they're sitting with Nicolas Maduro style, 1%, and that of the rest of the population living in extreme poverty. See, the only thing that I care about in terms of equality, as long as people have got their equal rights to agree to disagree with one another, and that's something that positive rights doesn't agree with. Positive rights is where they try to enforce their will upon you and they somehow think that a specific group of people have somehow got greater rights than what you have. Again, that's me speaking briefly. And he says, modified versions of capitalism. There is no modified versions of capitalism. There's capitalism, and it's basically the separation of the economy from government. It's an individualist system. See, if anybody tries to redefine capitalism outside of that, they don't know what capitalism is, because then you're trying to correlate capitalism with collectivism. I'll go into that. And he says that spread wealth without sacrificing overall prosperity, which is laughable given the fact that nothing even compares to a free market. And he says, such as the Nordic countries to a lesser extent. Well, what's he talking about? The Nordic countries are grossly misunderstood. First and foremost, these Nordic countries are hardly even sustainable economies in the long term. They're countries that are suffering as a result of their higher tax rates, and as a result of that, they're sitting with a severe lack of productivity in their domestic economies, and natural resources are not going to last forever, so their big extensive welfare states are eventually going to go in the bin. They're not going to be able to sustain the higher tax rates over a long period of time. It's just not going to happen. And what those Scandinavian economies had been doing, since the early 90s, as a result of what socialism caused, they began rolling back in their socialist policies. I mean, you only have to look at Denmark, who strongly deregulated in 2001. They're sitting with low levels of government regulation. So in other words, they're capitalist to some extent, and they're mixed economies. They're suffering as a result of the socialism that they're trying to preach, right? And they're trying to say that this is somehow fairer, and then he says Canada and all the rest of this. He says some may argue that a capitalist economy is not reliable, and it can explode in a matter of months, using the recent COVID-19 pandemic as an example. What the hell is he even going on about? You've been living under a mixed economy. Your entire private sector's all regulated by the state. What capitalist economies? How the hell was it capitalist to bail the banks out? What was capitalist about you trying to fix and manipulate interest rates and change the reserve ratios and take away people's free market money? That wasn't capitalist, that was anti-capitalist. And this is on a so-called RationalWiki site. These are the type of websites that people turn to for their information on capitalism and somehow think that they're getting something of reliability in of itself. Every economy that moved away from a free market was not reliable, which is the very reason why you face the booms and busts. Again, these are the type of people who would love to try and blame capitalism for the boom and bust cycle. But anyway, he goes on and says, however, in September 2021, only 1 year after the pandemic started, the total global output was higher than the pre-pandemic levels. Well, again, I don't even know where he's gone with this one, and it's very brief. It doesn't say much at all, because you've got to know what it is you're producing. It's all well having a high GDP. It's a bit like, looking at the Soviet Union and saying, well, look at their high GDP, yeah, very good. But what were they producing? Were they producing anything of real value? Or were they producing surplus waste? It's a bit like if you stare at the NHS. The NHS has been wasting £7.6 billion per year. In other words, just because you've got a high GDP, it doesn't mean to say that you're producing anything of value to the market. And this is the problem with today's mixed economy, with today's Keynesian style economy. It's very wasteful. Right, that's anti-capitalist. And he says it should be mentioned, however, that this recovery was uneven, with large differences in vaccination rates between countries being responsible for a considerable part of the unevenness of the recovery. Again, this idea of looking at all different countries and then expecting equality. It's also a case that you've got all these different cultures and all sorts. We don't all have the same interests in terms of things, and expecting equality in terms of all this stuff to do with the vaccinations and what have you. And then you had the issues to do with the government restrictions with the European Union, and therefore slowing down the process. So the very slowdown of the process of, certain vaccinations reaching certain countries and what have you was simply because of government's regulation as a result of the anti-capitalism. And he says, in particular, capitalism is far sight better than its predecessors. Well, that is true. And he says mercantilism and guilds, and they outlasted the idea of a command economy. The very mercantilism that dominated the British Industrial Revolution evolution right throughout the 19th century. All you've done is you've went from basically mercantilism to modern day mercantilism, which is basically a system called corporatism. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is the separation of the economy from government, when in real fact you're actually living under something of corporatocracy, where the giant corporations are basically more influential, or that are your politicians, and basically have power over government to some extent. It's a bit like if you look at the main American healthcare market that's rife with corporatism, and he's basically trying to pass this off as a capitalist system. And it's like I said in my last video, you get these type of people who claim to be so-called conservative and they don't even have a clue what capitalism is. And he says, it has also proven itself much more compatible with liberal ideas than either of these systems. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Of course it's compatible, because capitalism itself is all to do with economic liberty. In other words, it's capitalism that gives you your economic liberty. If you don't have capitalism, you don't have liberty. It's just that simple. It's your economics that dictates the freedom that you have to dictate your policy. It's not the policy that comes first, because if that was the case, then if you were living under communism, would you have that same economic liberty? No, of course you wouldn't. The liberal ideas that happen to follow from that stem from capitalism. He says there is a body of academic literature that suggests that capitalism may in fact be a prerequisite for the growth of progressive social values, or at the very least something that can help with their spread. Or on the other hand, there have been plenty of countries, example China and Russia, that loosened economic restrictions while maintaining violations of political and civil rights. Yes, to a varying extent on a question of scale, but you would look at China and Russia, you know, even after the Soviet Union, they just went down the road of corporatism. They never went down the road of free markets. So yes, in a question of scale, they would certainly become more capitalist compared to what they were. There's no question that in mixed economies, capitalism is present, but it's not a capitalist system. And then he says there is also a belief patterned on the democratic peace theory of liberal international relations that know to globalised capitalist countries. Again, how are they capitalist countries? If you're going to compare a country like the United States, for example, to that of Venezuela, then I suppose you could call it capitalist to some extent, but it still isn't a capitalist country. Trust me, it's far off it. It's not even close to being a capitalist country. It's a country rife with corporatism. It's corporatist. And then he says that no two globalised capitalist countries can or will go to war. Well, excuse me, since when has a capitalist economy led to war? The reality is, what you find is that it's through government's intervention. That's why even the United States of America during the 19th century was anything but strongly capitalist system. It was, even then, it was rife with mercantilism to some extent. The United States, I suppose, is a good example of a country that was at war within itself in terms of the capitalist class fighting that of the mercantilist class. He says, though this statement only tends to be true if you define democracy and capitalism such as this statement is true. What exactly is capitalism? He says the theory of free market capitalism calls for the following rights. Well, first of all, he's saying free market capitalism, exactly, it's to do with the free market. This isn't a free market today, because you couldn't even call the United States or any country in the West here free market. The right for each person to sell their labour to another person, well, okay, that's just brief. The right to do whatever one wishes with their own property, yeah, to a certain extent, but it's also more or less today with the economic liberty for government, for the market to freely regulate itself. He says, this entails, in theory, that one does not have to work except on terms acceptable to oneself. However, this also means that employers do not have to provide work except on terms acceptable to them. So people are not free to set the terms of their employment, and both parties must arrange a compromise that each finds acceptable. This concept of mutual benefit is an important idea to a capitalist theory. So capitalism is more or less about you having the freedom as an individual to choose whether you want to work for somebody else. It basically gives you the economic liberty to choose, and through individual rights you come to some sort of mutual agreement and what have you. Okay, there's a consensual agreement for you to work for another company and all the rest of this. The idea that no exchange will take place unless both parties benefit, barring fraud, that is true. Right, this part is true relative to capitalism, right? In other words, it's not done through some government taxation where they force money out of your pockets and force you to pay for other people. However, this assumes that both parties to a contract have alternatives. I don't even know where he's gone with that one. It just simply means that if, two parties, if there isn't an agreement upon an exchange, it doesn't take place. That's all that means, right? I don't even know why he even brings into the word alternatives. It's got nothing at all to do with that. In fact, in a free market anyway, you would have alternatives. That's just the reality of a free market economy. It says that is access to a competitive market. You're going to have a competitive market in a free market. If you're expecting not to have a competitive market in a free market, you're just making things up as you go along. Is this basically where these type of people are going to go down the road of this monopolies myth? Because monopolies all stem from government's intervention. Here it goes. I didn't even read this section and already I've just predicted what he's going to say. He says, if a monopoly is established, well, how do you think monopolies are formed? It's done through socialist government interventionism. Monopolies do not owe their origins to that of a free market. Monopolies cannot form in a free market. This is exactly where it goes back to the original point, the first section, where he mentioned about centralised oversight to keep those from running out of control. You basically require the government to set down barriers to entry into the market for monopolies to exist. When it came to the myth of the robber barons, these robber barons were not, monopolists. And they weren't robber barons at all. And what defines a monopoly? Again, a monopoly means that you own 100% share of the market, there's no competition whatsoever, and it would drive the prices up to shaft the consumer. And you saw between 1840 to 1900 the consumer price index falling across the economy, which contradicts the utter nonsense. So again, let's just go on. He says, if a monopoly is established or merchants conspire to fix the supply, then the price of a product can artificially inflated. Well, that's not going to happen in a capitalist system. And he says, in theory, a competitor could now enter the market as they could offer the product at a cost lower than that of the inflated one. He says, although in this case lobbyists often coerce government. Well, what the hell is this often coerced government? What's that got to do with that of a capitalist system? That's anti-capitalism. That's what you call political entrepreneurship. That's what you call lobbyists lobbying for socialist government interventionism for you to impose socialism into the economy to set down barriers to begin with. It's how you understand what capitalism is and what socialism is in this mixed economy. Capitalism's today with the free market, it's about leaving the market be to regulate itself. You're talking about capitalism, you're talking about free trade. It is often claimed that the free market capitalism leads to wealth accruing into the hands of the fewer as trade persists. Rubbish. We can see that for history that it certainly wasn't the case, and it was actually through government's intervention. He says, although it can be shown that this is caused by the speculative nature of trade, no, it's not. And again, we've got the recorded history to speak for itself that contradicts that complete and utter nonsense. They don't even understand the economic history themselves. They're probably believers of the myth of the robber barons. And he says, well, the exact origins of the concept of private property are hard to trace. It's widely recognised that capitalism developed pretty organically, with few noticeable exceptions like vagabond laws, land appropriation, enclosure. Again, what's he talking about? Again, true private ownership's not about, setting down all these sort of restrictions and all the rest of it. In the late 18th century, possibly in popular response to Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke, feudalism and later mercantilism had protected ruling economic classes in Europe reaching back to the 9th century. Well, again, that's nothing at all to do with capitalism, that's anti-capitalism, and the American Revolutionary War was a capitalist revolution against that. So as capitalism slowly undid these centres of power as entrepreneurs convinced landowners to invest in business enterprises, developed its own means of production, contributed to increasing standards of living. Well, that's all true. And he says, and sometimes exploited the peasants for their cheap labour. Okay, this is the whole thing with the Industrial Revolution. It's that whole argument again with the exploitation nonsense. If you're getting paid mere wages, and your wages are, something unprecedented, and your growth is unprecedented, you're working fewer, hours a week, etc. I hardly call that exploitation. That's not to say exploitation does not exist in every system, of course it does. It says capitalism has trucked along. There may have been a few people who disagreed along the way, but they are state capitalist. Well, there's no such thing as a state capitalist country, right? State capitalism isn't capitalism, it's just anti-capitalism. It's a complete contradiction of everything capitalism stands for. And he says it evolved naturally into a peace-loving commonwealth of independent states. Laughable. He says, so almost everybody, even those of an anarcho-capitalist persuasion, and he says, has written off the idea of a complete alternative. Capitalism is well known for inspiring such stoic and moral attitudes in the people who benefit from its fruits. Well, that's all well said and done. If you're speaking about that today with a capitalist system, that's not to say people don't benefit even from capitalism in this mixed economy, but you're not living in a capitalist system. So then, the most important bit of all, he says examples of capitalist countries. So let's look at this wee paragraph. He says, no societies of notable size have allowed for complete laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, by the way, basically means individualism, and that's the only capitalism there is, right? There is no other capitalism. So if you're talking about a system that's anti-individualist, it's not capitalist. Speaking about a mixed economy, filled rancid with socialist government interventionism, as mainstream economists today do not consider this to be feasible. I don't even know where he gets that information from. Probably reading for that of like Keynesians, so to speak, right? In other words, the type of people who themselves don't even understand capitalism or anything at all today yet. He says, it became clear in the age of monopolistic trusts. Isn't that funny how I predicted that he believes in the myth of the robber barons? It just tells you he doesn't even understand history. And this is it in a nutshell, folk. He's trying to pull capitalism outside of individualism, which is impossible, because to do so means you're going to have to some extent, correlate capitalism to collectivism, a word, by the way, that's synonymous to socialism. So how can you have a capitalism that's relative to socialism to any extent? You just cannot. You can't, for the life of you, correlate capitalism on any level to that of socialism. Now, what you've got in a system today is a system where they've forced you into a collective group, they've stripped you of your individual rights and liberty, and have forced you to collectively, keyword collectively in reference to socialism, to collectively pay for the losses of special interest groups. And he's trying to pass off this as some form of, capitalism. And this is the first time I've even looked at the article, and already, just for me going through it, I says, I bet you anything, he's somebody who believes in the myth of the robber barons. I even came across him mentioned about Monopolies. I knew right away because he's predictable. He's the type of person that's not even got a clue what he's going on about. And there he is, he's mentioning about that today with the trusts of the late 19th century. In other words, he's the type of person who believes the myth that the likes of Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, etc. somehow held monopolies when they never. And that's precisely the problem you've got today, folk. This emphasises the very point that it's not just a case that the Marxists haven't got a clue about capitalism. You've got a lot of people like this who claim to be so-called conservative, who claim to be whatever the bloody hell they claim to be. They claim to support capitalism, but they don't even have a clue what capitalism is. So in other words, what they end up supporting subconsciously is corporatism. And what is that? It's basically the belief that you need to intervene through the use of government to apparently keep capitalism in check, because apparently if you leave it be, it'll lead to all these monopolies springing up for everywhere. And that is to say that he doesn't even understand the true history of the late 19th century today with the giant trusts. He says, in totally unregulated free market, well, that wasn't the case in the late 19th century. He says there is nothing to keep the more powerful and wealthy from manipulating the economy for their own benefit, which is a load of pish, because they never held monopolies. And then he says the effect of these manipulations is close to markets, to competition, and to coerce workers into below equilibrium wages, bullshit, given the fact that the United States wages throughout the Industrial Revolution saw unprecedented wage growth. And what I mean by unprecedented is simple. It was something that was never seen before. It's the very fact that the way he's trying to paint all this is as if to say that, oh, they were so awful and therefore what they needed was government to come and save the day. And this person claims to support capitalism. He basically goes on and says, thereby making it totally free market, a far cry from free. What's he talking about, far cry from free? And he says, moreover, such a system makes income inequality. This guy's basically a bloody socialist, right? He's going on about income inequality. How can you claim to support capitalism and then complain about income inequality? You're supposed to have income inequality. What sense is there in income equality? It's not rational. You're going to have people who work harder than others. You're going to have certain people who are better skilled than others. You're going to have people who are just natural. That's the whole point of capitalism. Capitalism's based on rewarding on merit. It's not about, forcing everybody to get paid the same wage. How's that even fair anyway? To force people to get paid and end in the same place. The question has instead become to what extent societies and markets should be regulated. Yeah, by people who are basically economically illiterate. I'm not even going to take economic illiteracy seriously, especially that of yourself, mate, and telling folk about some, myth of the robber barons. You've even went as far as to try and claim that capitalism has got something to do with these monopolies. Funny enough, through that keeping the private sector in check through the government, that's essentially what gave rise to the monopolies. But he goes on and he mentions Japan, right, as an example. Okay, it was somewhat, it's questionable, somewhat free market to a level between 1950 to about 1990. Singapore, you would say, yes, was strongly free market. I would agree upon that to some level of extent. On a question of scale, there's no question about the fact that, yes, there was government to some level, whether it was housing or whatnot. But in terms of typically what defines a free market is one that's strongly free to freely trade, freely do business, to freely exchange, etc. And it was, on a question of scale, a very strong free market economy with regards to business and exchange and that of trade as such. But yeah, Singapore is the only country there, or shall I say city, that you would probably say was free market. And of course, you would say Hong Kong between 1950 or 1948 right up to 1997. The United Anti-Capitalist, Pro-Socialist, Corporatist United States of America, of all countries, and he tries to list this country as somehow being that of capitalist. How the hell does he even draw to that logical conclusion? Right? And that's exactly the point that I'm making. But even if he's studied American political and economic history, he should bloody well know that between 1860, all thanks to that of, Abraham Lincoln, he was, of course, very favourable to Henry Clay. He was a Hamiltonian, so to speak. If you don't understand anything at all to do with American history, Alexander Hamilton was the enemy of capitalism. He was the founder of cronyism in the United States. And that's who Abraham Lincoln was. He was basically a Hamiltonian. And it was as a result of him that for 50 odd years, leading right up to the Federal Reserve in 1913, it was because of him you saw creeping corporatism, right? The foundations of it. So in other words, the United States of America was moving in the opposite direction of a capitalist economy, and there he is trying to pass off the United States of America, a strongly corporatist country, a country rife with strong government regulation over the private sector that isn't even truly private, and he says that that's a capitalist country. Have that for a laugh. It's no wonder that these Marxists turn around and say to folk about, the faults of capitalism, because it's these type of people that are leading these type of people to think that they are living in a capitalist system when they're not. These people, for the life of them, would have to be completely irrational to try and correlate capitalism to collectivism. Collectivism is a word antinomous to capitalism. That means collectivism, by all means, is the opposite meaning to capitalism. There's nothing remotely anything capitalist about collectivism. Collectivism is the complete opposite of everything capitalism stands for. And what you've got in these type of economies, just like the United States of America, is not only this over-regulated private sector, you've got a type of economy that rewards failure and punishes success. Just like what you saw of the banking crisis, where they kept on rewarding failure by bailing out the failing banks, and they had the special interest groups where the taxpayer was collectively forced, keyword collectively, forced to pay for the losses of those special interest groups. In other words, is essentially inherently collectivist to some extent. You wouldn't say the United States is this full-blown, collectivist economy and collectivist political system, because you wouldn't go as far as to say it's something like that of the Soviet Union. But it most certainly is not this, strongly capitalist economy. Essentially what capitalism, and it's not based on my view of capitalism, it's based on what capitalism is. It's basically an individualist system. And when you look at the definition, and I've pointed this out numerous times before, folk, when you look at the definition of individualism, it defines the free market. You can see what it means through the freedom of the market left be to regulate itself in the absence of government regulation. Basically, it's defining the free market. And that is basically what capitalism's all about. It's an individualist system. It's got nothing at all to do with this, system you see today. So where you can spot capitalism in a mixed economy might be the small things. For example, seeing prices freely flow and fluctuate in the marketplace, where it's left be to the laws of supply and demand. You see that within retail companies and what have you. But what is not capitalist is all that government regulation to basically dictate and control the market. Things relative to quantity controls, quality controls, government set those type of things. Or if it's not that, it's government regulation over safety things and all the rest of it. That's anti-capitalism. So what you've got is this strong mixture between capitalism and socialism. I would not say that capitalism is something to do with controlling and manipulating an interest rate below the market value, because when you're speaking about the market value of something, you're speaking about capitalism. Isn't it funny how I was able to predict exactly what we was going to say in terms of the usual nonsense where they say, capitalism cannot regulate itself, and we need to keep it in check because, all hell would break loose, the sky would cave in, they would get poorly exploited, and monopolies would spring up from everywhere. And bloody well tell he was taught through his government education system. This is why you cannot trust these sites like these wiki websites, etc. And these are the type of websites, by the way, that lefties turn to religiously. By Christ, have you ever seen a lefty who hasn't turned to that of Wikipedia or some wiki website? And you'd seriously have to be irrational if you honestly think you can correlate capitalism in any extent to collectivism, because essentially that is collectivist when you're forcing people into a collective group, stripping them of their individual rights and liberty, and then forcing them to pay for the losses of others. Exactly what you saw of the 2008 financial crisis. If you honestly think that's capitalist, I'm lost for words. That's actually the very reason why you're in this mess today, because of all the anti-capitalism. And if he had actually read anything at all to do with, the likes of Ludwig von Mises or the Mises Institute that's been telling him for years or what have you, he would be able to actually inform himself about all this, but it's clear he has not. So anyway, folk, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add in yourself. Be sure to like the video, share the video, and what have you. And of course, thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.